when there are discussions in Germany on new mobility, then mostly there is the focus on the pure electrification of mobility. And my feeling is that the issue of data doesn't get enough attention. We always say that data is the new oil, data is the new gold, but that's a sentence that people just say, and then the discussion really continues with electrification. So I wonder, in Germany, have we made enough headway with this topic, or can others perhaps come up with a platform for mobility for the future? How complex is it to gain mobility data? So I'm looking forward to this panel so much that Martin Fröhlich put together, and it's really a highlight because we'll talk about data in depth, and maybe there will be a reply to some of these questions that I've been wondering about. Welcome, Martin. Yeah, wonderful. So this is the third day in a row. Welcome to the Hypermotion, and it's just great that we're here in person again, and we're all sticking to the 3G rules. So the topic here at Hypermotion in Frankfurt: goodbye data salad. Data thinking is the future. Is that true? Yes or no? I'm looking forward to an interesting debate with the panel here. So we've already broken the ice amongst ourselves. Basically, we'll start with a brief introductory round. You can do that better than I can, just to make sure that you don't make any mistakes. Liza, you start. Why are you here, and what is your link to the topic of data? I'm a PhD student at Twente University in the Netherlands, and my topic is data thinking. And up until yesterday, I was working for an automotive company, so I can tell you a little bit about what's going on in that area. It's wonderful that you found the time to come here. Then the second person here. So, wearing green. Wolfgang, can you hear us? Can you see us digitally? Yeah, wonderful. Martin, wonderful to see you all. I just want to tell you a little bit about myself. I'm a professor for IT at the University of Saarland, and I work at the Center for Artificial Intelligence, and I work on this topic regarding companies. And there's a new branch here with quantum computing and combining that with AI, and that is basically a completely new aspect. So the team size 30 plus, and we're still looking for PhD students. Okay, great. Wonderful to have you with us. Dirk, to you. I'd love to hear more from you. So my name is Dirk Hofmann. I'm one of the founders of the DAIN Studios. So we are a company with about 40 employees, and data thinking is something that we deal with almost every day, because we help companies to basically find their way through the data jungle. And data is something I've been working on for 15 years, first on the corporate side and then with the other company. Wonderful that you're here today. Stephan, so we know each other, our stories are quite similar. We are both from Deutsche Bahn. Thank you for inviting me. My name is Stephan Kaulbach. I'm the head of Data Intelligence Center Deutsche Bahn. So what is that? Basically, we have two main tasks. One is data that we have in the trains, that we make it transparent, so that we become aware of what data there is. And then the second part is making this data available. We do that with data thinking methods, and basically we want to make the use of data interesting. So we also want to use AI and other methods of analytics. Wonderful. So, to the audience out there, you can also enter your questions in our app online, and then we can ask the questions for you. But we'll just start here with our discussion now. Data thinking, is it design thinking with data? Is this one way to describe it, the entire topic? I personally believe there are different ways of looking at this thing. So I've done some research with my PhD project. And with my project, basically data thinking and design, there's this link here, and we want to have user-oriented AI solutions and machine learning solutions. But there are other points of view as well. So Dirk and Tizian, I know you as well at your company. So different workshops that we did. And then this design thinking background was really important, this innovation method where you try to have the people on board and to have an added value to say different stakeholders have to be on board. They have different backgrounds, and not everybody is a data scientist. Not everybody understands the data. Not even the data scientists don't all know what kind of data exists, what kind of IT tools. And here, I thought there was a great additional value. In the company where I was previously, in the big company, that was a completely new approach. And maybe you can confirm as well that there's a new approach here that wasn't really established. Yeah. The basic philosophy is the same. And that's the difference as opposed to the past with this philosophy, with this problem of the user. So this is what data thinking and design thinking have in common. We see really often with different companies that there's a bottom-up approach, so that there's a lot of data, but we have to do something with the data. We try to turn this around, and we say, as you said, so a data specialist, that's one thing, but being aware of the problems is another thing. And with the data that is available, or the data that can be generated or acquired, we try to have a link here, and I think this is where the two worlds come together. We see a big advantage. So there's data literacy, and people have to be involved who don't see themselves as data experts, but who are domain experts. And I think design thinking and data thinking are the basic philosophy. And yeah, there's a very similar approach there. Wolfgang, how do you feel about this? So everything that was said just now, that's something that we see in everyday life, basically in practice. So I work together with companies a lot, and there are two things. On the one hand, the people who really deal with the data and have data analytical methods. So typically they are people from technology. The typically database-oriented people struggle a bit more. So physicists and mathematicians are very sought after because perhaps they have a more pragmatic approach. That's the technical part. And then there's the other part, the corporate part. And the CEO, CFO, CXO, there the question arises, what is the point of all this? Because data can't just be an end in itself. The question arises, which services can I have here? Which ones can I even offer? And people like Elon Musk, they are really so far ahead of us in terms of the use that can exist here. So if we want to bring this together, the question is, who is the person who is responsible for the data in a company? At the moment, that's not just 1, 2, 3 people, but in big companies, thousands of people are in charge. That makes everything much more complicated. So looking at you, Stephan, Deutsche Bahn, in all business areas, there's so much data. Perhaps you could collect more data, but then at that point, sometimes I think, oh dear, capacity overflow, too much information. There has to be a funnel somewhere. So how do you do that with Deutsche Bahn? What's been your experience been over the past few years? What worked and what didn't work? I'd just like to answer your question first of all, and I'd like to add something to what Wolfgang said as well, because there was a good keyword here. So there's a bottom-up approach, which means that we go into the specific areas. We look at the core competencies that we have with Deutsche Bahn. One example is the disposition. I think those of you who don't know much about Deutsche Bahn, there are disponents who make sure that the trains leave in the right order, and they can control who is in charge when. So of course you can imagine that KI methods are very helpful. And what we heard earlier There are experts who have a disposition, but they're not data experts. They don't know about data. So these two worlds come together, and then basically what information can be a part of this. And then there's this iterative process. So when it comes to design thinking or this approach, that's really important that we are iterative, that we have something where we can have the first use case really early on, which leads to okay, I understand that eureka moment, and then feature by feature we add to this, and then basically the appetite comes while eating. But what Wolfgang said is an important point as well, and that's a challenge for us, especially in the big companies, for example, Deutsche Bahn, these data owner issues. So who is in charge of data? This is a big process, which, because it's an ongoing process, that's something that will continue for some time because there's no clear solution at present. What happens with it? What happens if somebody makes a wrong decision? The concerns of the people. I'm basically passing my data on. Somebody else will use this data and then something happens. So primarily we have to realize that technology processes aren't the issue, culture. So the culture and understanding of data, creating that's important. Just drawing on what you said just now, often there's a wrong understanding about what ownership means. So what is owning something? What is being responsible for something? From my point of view, that's a method where data thinking does help to overcome these borders and to have good examples. So topics, for example, having a shared understanding that there's lots of data, that there's an understanding that there's a problem, but still most people have issues with these first steps. So some say, okay, first we have to sort everything out, who does what when, who doesn't do things when, and there's an impossible process here. But when the use cases are impossible, then the goal isn't clear, and then data validity is basically at an abstract level. So this easy method, I'd say data thinking is an easy method where you can start. And based on that, step by step, we have these problems. And that's one of the challenges with these methods, so scaling it up. So on the one hand, POC, and then having a first prototype. And there are many companies who have whole PowerPoint slides full of examples, but then basically they have issues with scaling things. And that's the interface where both topics have to be approached. But as you said, there has to be this appetite on the one hand. There has to be hands-on examples where you can say this works, here we have to work on things, and then the next steps too. Yeah, so there's this mix. Looking back, thinking about Deutsche Bahn, there's so much data there, but how can you basically pick out the most important things? How is that possible? Do you have parameters where you can just look at things and say, yes, this is good, this is bad, and then in the future we only focus on the good things so that we don't have to sort the other things out? I think the question is, and that's something that we discuss really often, what is a data asset? And often the point is that data themselves don't have any value. We have to be honest about that. So data is there, and the value is created when something happens with the value. So if it's integrated in the process, and yeah, if sales are increased, then the value in it happens. But basically just going through the company and saying, yeah, data asset here or there, that's not the right approach. You have to look at the benefits. What is the process? What is the driving force that could make this better? So it's not just about increasing sales, it's also about punctuality, for example, with Deutsche Bahn. There's so many facts that everybody knows about, because if you don't talk about the weather, you talk about how possibly late the German Deutsche Bahn is. So back to you. What did you examine in your work? What was one of the results where you had this eureka moment? One main takeaway or one realization for me was, with the big company where I worked, that it's very important to integrate the user in the process, because I realize, and that's where I actually come from with my work, that in the department where I was, new tools were developed, but there was always just this development, and then at the end the user came and was presented with something, and then he was told to work with it. Or, for example, now we're going to have a fancy AI solution or machine learning solution, but the user wasn't integrated, and that was the realization where, and that's why I focused on my work and also this design thinking approach. It is so important to have user-oriented approaches, and you can't say, yes, I'll have this great KI solution or machine learning. It's really fancy and everybody thinks it's great, but at the end of the day, there has to be an added value for the user. And for me, it was the engineers who work with these tools. They, of course, at the end of the day, don't care about the data behind it or the machine learning solution. At the end of the day, what is important is the following thing: working faster, simplifying things, optimizing things. That is what counts. And that's where I realized that these euros have to be integrated right from the outset, but then the user also has to understand what is involved here. So that was one of the issues that they said, yes, we want this, and machine learning can do this, but there was so much involved there in the algorithms that just doesn't work that simply. And that was one of the realizations in these workshops, that is important that the people understand what is involved here, even if at the end of the day they don't really care, because the important thing is the solution about the process being improved. And then it's still important, though, that they understand that it's not just magic, basically, but the time is necessary for that before it is automated and before it works by KI.
Precisely. In the workshops which we did, even this year, we collected data manually. We trained the algorithm manually, and then we generated value added with it. But at the beginning, the users didn't understand that we have to do it. And at the end, this was appreciated more, including all the solutions that were hidden behind it, even for the engineers who are not data scientists. Wolfgang, what about you? You are at the Institute of Artificial Intelligence. You are working daily with data. How do companies approach you? What are your major challenges? Well, it's very different. The bandwidth is very large. With the leading automotive manufacturers, the past 30 years, we cooperated intensively. We have understanding. And they have understanding for the need of AI and data-driven processes, but that has made its way only recently. We researched in it, but it didn't make the way directly into the use and useful benefit. So the bandwidth is very large. In industrial research, to do classical preventive maintenance, when do you have to do maintenance at the machine line? Because you cannot do each machine individually, especially in automotive understanding, you couldn't produce regularly. So such anticipation is important. We also do a lot in the health system, which is about the patients. The patients has to be in the focus, hence personalized medicine. Everyone runs with us everywhere, and you can see in medicine very nicely in which epoch we are living, especially here in Germany. We have our medical data in the most various qualities, distributed mostly. But, of course, I want to have the best possible medicine at the end of the day. And we develop solutions to detect diseases early on, develop and apply therapies, things like supporting patients even at home. That's what we do at the moment. Or we also do doping analysis for the world, anti-doping analysis, EPO analysis, blood analysis, urine analysis, whether doping is needed, whether something has changed something, lapping, dopings and the like. Very different use cases and application we deal with, and then we try to turn this into questions we can answer with our methods. Sometimes it works very well, sometimes not. and sometimes data are not available. Hence, the spectrum is enormously large, from industry into private life, health system, well, almost everything. There is no industry not affected by such topics, not dealing with such matters. And we discuss it at the strategic level and in terms of implementation with the right approaches. One important aspect, especially with a view to AI, artificial intelligence and data, people oftentimes mix up things. On the one hand, we read about artificial intelligence in products. So there can be computer vision to detect errors and mistakes, highly delimited areas, and that then becomes kind of a magic box, or people want one. On the other hand, which we realize, and this is very important for the companies, is process orientation and optimization. As Wolfgang said, if you have a production line and want to optimize it, it doesn't help to have computer vision on one machine or other methods, sensors detecting errors, but you have to understand the full process, and the data of the various components need to be interlinked and brought together. And that needs what you said. You need the domain experts understanding what optimizes the machines. You also need to understand who has to come in at what time, and you need to know that your machine needs maintenance or goes bust. But second, you also need to design your processes such that you can repair them in good time. I've seen many cases where we had percentage figures of 80, 85, with which we could anticipate that machine would go bust, but the process was not so optimal that the engineer comes in good time, or the mechanic. So you cannot realize the full value. It leads to disappointment in the management on sea level. So it's the conflict that on the one hand you want the magic black box. Sometimes you could sell it very well, at best with two lamps, green and red. On the other hand, it's again the perception which needs to be created that is only an augmented reality subject, combining the artificial intelligence with domains. Then you can create the values, which is painstaking because people need to change. Of course, you can do digital transformation, use other terms, but you don't like to change. And that's a basic condition for things to change. And sometimes this is a reason why things don't happen in 1 or 2 years, but maybe in 5 or 10 years' time. And that, again, is also our ambition to motivate the people, but also to show that certain steps need to be undertaken systematically, and then things work faster. Stephan, what about you? What would you wish to happen in Deutsche Bahn or in other big companies? You're also someone putting forward demands. What kind of data should be collected and what you need to have results which can be evaluated? Well, I don't wish to have more data. We have data everywhere. We collect them. All the while, we also equip our trains with sensors. So data procurement is not a big issue. But as I said before, the data which are there need to be available freely for use. So what you need for that? Well, on the one hand, the board of Deutsche Bahn took a courageous decision to undertake this step. They decided that the data should be freely available in the group, and the data may be used, of course, abiding by the data protection guidelines and the like, but operative data and the like can be shared in the company. And then there's the challenge, as I said before, who takes over responsibility on what is happening. Something I would wish to see is a cultural change just like this overnight. That's the biggest challenge we are faced with at the moment, not providing the technology or establishing a process, but enabling the people that can dish out the data, and it doesn't hurt. creating this culture in line with data. And that's the biggest challenge. And it won't happen overnight or by management decision. That is really work with the people in the right areas. Can you do stock taking of data? Good question. Well, to put it in the right perspective, if we say data are the new oil, oil has a big value, and companies like Excel and BP for many years and decades were the most precious companies of the world because they processed this oil. If we say data are the new oil, the auditors ask the question, and how can I take it to the balance sheet? Answer as of now, not at all. It's hard to appreciate which value is linked to the data. As Stephan said, if you have data, the use of it brings the benefit. Hence, data as such, the appreciation of them is difficult. And as soon as you take input data, put them in a learning system, and the result, what comes out, doesn't belong to the one who owned the data at the beginning. Someone who put in the data. Hence, there are legal questions of regulation regarding the rights, regarding the balance sheets, handling the data, and driving it even further. It's about the question, as mentioned by Stephan, namely, if you have data in a company, in large companies, well, there are many options. The Deutsche Bahn doesn't have difficulties to generate data. It looks totally different with SMEs. They are lacking these possibilities, and then these companies hit at fundamental limits that they cannot even get this oil. So, as was done with the German and the French Economics Ministry in line with Gaia X. The basic idea is also to share data, but for that you need the right possibilities regarding the rights of processing the data. Then a baker around the corner can also say, I participate in the data, I pay for the data, but I can use it to offer better service to my customers. Because many companies are not able to collect their own data in the right quality, which is needed, or even hire data scientists. And if we don't come to grips with that regarding stock taking, but also the economic sharing of data, then in comparison with the large platforms, as we know them from US and China, will lag behind in the course of time in economic terms with enormous impacts. I'm a great friend of an open access movement. What's your opinion on that? Well, it looks attractive. It sounds attractive at first glance. We also did the data for the city of Helsinki. There, open data was a big issue, but it goes hand in glove with what Wolfgang said, namely the responsibility with a view to data sharing. What is the value added? It was easy to provide the data, and then you know that the snowplow moves through the street every day, which is interesting, but this doesn't take you to the level which gets value. Hence, it's a good topic for a beginning, for a head start, but there also need to be a driver standing behind it. And that was one of our tasks, to work out there, saying Helsinki should car-free because they want to be carbon neutral, and then have a clear motivation, and then you can go about these topics totally differently. And as you said before, well, we provide the data, and then there's a data lake, data scientist jumps in, finds the golden nugget, and the problem is solved. I have not yet seen this. And, well, open data, whatever you may call it, doesn't resolve the problem of responsibility and to work in a solution-oriented fashion. So that still need to be resolved, and someone needs to shoulder responsibility for it. The big question is which initiatives to undertake. I see the difference between Germany and Finland, for example, in health. We do the work about the future of clinical studies, and there is a health record. In Germany, well, we worked with a large pharmaceutical company, and we couldn't have done the project in Germany because it would have taken 3 years to agree on names, how to name the project for a start. And this is our very problem, that we are very fragmented and have difficulties to find someone who undertakes the driving role and shoulders responsibility. Well, I still wish to see a stress-free individual guide. You can take the data from Google and so forth, but I want to have it stress-free. I don't want to open the window all the while and look for everything. I just want to see it on my desk and have a personal escort and guide. There have been such initiatives. It's a complex issue, but as a user, you want to travel without any stress, and it would be ideal to develop such a thing. Yes, by all means. There are various initiatives at Deutsche Bahn. On that, there was such a travel body, an SMS-based solution. So by means of SMS, you could get to a dialogue with a chat robot, organizing train travels and hotel booking. It was an experiment we did 2-3 years ago. Now we have an area, New Mobility, intensively dealing with answering these questions. So we cannot do it traditionally as before. At Deutsche Bahn, just moving the trains over the tracks, but like in the competition of the platform, we have a digital system behind it. Then we have an entire chain which we manage. We do the new mobility. Then you have the digitally driven areas. They're the first apps on the market. They don't even run under the brand Bahn, but they have their own brand also to taken into the new neutrality, because if we talk about traveling, we talk about end-to-end solutions from the doorstep to your target. And you don't only use Deutsche Bahn on the way, so it's an integrated system.
Yes, exactly. Nemo was a different story, and I think that's something you can Google now as well. I don't want to have too many advertisements here, but basically we don't have to make the people more confused. We want to give them the best way to be connected to the content. We don't want them to spend too much time from getting from A to B. So in your company, do you often have the experience that people say, hey, how do I collect data, or here's my data, can you please make something useful with this, or let's have a media case? What kind of use cases are there? Who, at the end of the day, do we want to service with which models at the end of the day? So what is the case here? Well, there are 2 points of view, basically. So some people come to us and say, yes, we have a lot of data, and we want to turn this into money, basically. And then we realize that in the discussion, there's no basic understanding of how to use this information themselves. And we've seen this discussion for quite some time, up to a time where discussions are carried out with smart harbors, smart cities, wherever the word smart comes up, basically different ecosystems with different players have to work together. And then it's often those who are very innovative, who are very aggressive, then all of a sudden they press the pause button. And if there are discussions with some people where we want to swap data, then there's this fear that maybe the other side will be smarter using data than we are ourselves. So from my point of view, it's really important to be aware of your world. What added values do you want? How can this data be used? To have a basic understanding of this. This topic of turning data into money, that sounds very attractive for many companies, and there's some pressure there for some business as well, because the old business model is under fire, having to look for something new. And then there's this urgency. What we try is to try and think about where we come from. And what I find really interesting is thinking about the time before COVID. We often had this discussion. We want to do something with AI, we want to do something with our data, but it's got to be cool. So when we talked about optimization, that wasn't that interesting. One person said something cool, definitely, but not finance. That was totally boring. And that has changed so much. So I'd say since the middle of last year, we've been talking about process optimization a lot. How can my current business be understood better? How can I help it make headway? That's the right approach, because all these innovative things are still upcoming. And thinking about the data is so important. Data thinking too. So people coming up to us, if they say, I want to do something with my data, then we always turn the question around and say, let's understand what the most important questions are that we want to have answers to. We don't ask you about the data that you have. We ask you about what is difficult for you as a CEO, what is the decision that you have to make tomorrow, and then we look together. Is the data available in businesses that can answer that question? So A, that is so much closer to the expertise of the C-level, for example, from the domain expert, and B, it's impact driven. So I think that's much more sustainable. So everybody wants to be a YouTuber these days, full-time ideally. Everybody's traveling through the world. Nobody wants to come home anymore. The sooner the better. So these new forms, data scientists. Liza, would you like to be this type of data scientist? What is your journey in the future? Where do you want to be? Where do you see yourself? So I'm an engineer, actually, not a data scientist. The following is really interesting for me. In terms of data thinking, it's innovative. So we really try to create innovation. And that's what I want to achieve as well. Having innovation. I'm not a data scientist. And it's really interesting because there's this design thinking base and data science database. That is something that's involved in there too. So I'm not a person who does that at the moment, but I've always worked together with other people, and this interdisciplinary approach is fascinating to me. In big corporations, we see that people aren't strangers anymore. We don't just have the IT department and the engineers. We see that there's more and more cooperation happening. In Scrum, in Agile development, that is so important. That's a great development that I want to support. But I don't need to be a data scientist for that. Okay, Stephan, what's the next step for you? For Deutsche Bahn, what's the next goal? So first opening it, then saying, okay, all business units can have access to the data and see what develops. But there has to be a central point that develops all this, and this expertise has to be assumed. Is that your division? No, and that won't be the case either. That simply doesn't work, because that would mean we're a bottleneck, an ivory tower. What we actually do is that the knowledge is created where it belongs, where the core competencies are. We basically make sure that the understanding is awakened. What does it mean to work with data? When it comes to specific solutions, there are enough parts in Deutsche Bahn that become active, but we need this understanding. There's two things we do. On the one hand, just formally, there's the legal framework that we can access this data division, what Dirk said earlier, so creating these structures, who has responsibility, creating responsibility, achieving this, but then also having the understanding that this culture is changed with different use cases, working together that way. On the one hand, that's a top-down movement in terms of structure. On the other hand, it's an bottom-up use case development. So there can't just be one brain in Deutsche Bahn which things for everybody involved, that won't work. The competency remains where it belongs, with the people who do the work. So when I think about Deutsche Bahn, where I work, I basically build bridges. I am a networker. I don't know much about data, but I did a design thinking course. So Stephan, could I maybe get in touch with you if I needed your support short term, if I want to develop something? So is it like with Gorillas, 10 minutes later you're there, or somebody from your team and supports me? Yes, we do that too. So when the ideas are there, we do that. And as you said, we do design thinking methods where we try these things out. So what would it feel like? What is your pain? That's what we talked about earlier as well. So having the people involved in the process, because usually the people come from the perspective of needs, of problems. I have to be faster, better, whatever. And then with the methods, we say this is how it could work. Just one final sentence for this. AI is not always a solution. Then lots of people say, yeah, at the end of the day, this little robot will come and solve my problem. Often we've seen, I don't want to really exaggerate, but sometimes just Excel sheets are enough. Sometimes having a structured approach is enough, and you don't necessarily need an algorithm. So you said it's a shame that Wolfgang can't be here. He has different appointments. He's here digitally, but why is it so important to you to work together with you? So data on the one hand and other things on the other hand, what can you do? So we work together with the colleagues very closely. We are also part of a team that's called Spacer, about resilience in businesses, and that is so important. So as Deutsche Bahn, how can we become more resilient? How can we be positioned so that changes which happen outside in business because of the weather, all these different things that can affect us, how can that be involved in the system? And what really helps me a lot is that the people in the process, they get all this information at one point, and having this information presented in a way so that the person can make the decision the way he or she needs to make the decision, so that the process can continue to the next step. That is what we're working on very closely with the colleagues, and I think that's why we'll see each other in Jena soon too. Wolfgang, did you initiate Spacer? Who was the patron of that program? Well, I don't want to praise myself too much, but I'm the coordinator. And I basically created all this together with a colleague from Aachen, a colleague from DZL, from a machine lab. And a long time before COVID, we thought about how German industry can deal with disruptions. A disruption is something that you don't know where it came from. So you said that you want to basically be a pig that searches for truffles, and we want to be a digital pig that searches for truffles, which realizes that there is a problem before the problem even affects the business. Of course, we also deal with problems that have already risen. For example, a machine is broken, or we realize that there's the wrong input material, that the wrong steel was used, for example, or a tool is at the end of its lifespan, and so on and so forth. But above and beyond this, we want to look to the future. We have another future topic, payers, and with this, we, in inverted commas, also want to envisage situations. We do that with the Technisches Hilfswerk, the aid organization, because they have to provide support in crises that haven't even been detected yet. So they have so much experience, so much data, and we want to broaden the horizon here, and we want to make sure that potential future worlds can be extrapolated from the worlds which are not very likely. So that is very complex, it's very difficult, and if a bit more transparency is possible here, that can help a lot to have economic advantages in competition. So that's something that we've been working on for a long time already, and we hope that we'll be able to extend this further, especially in conjunction with Deutsche Bahn. But there are 50 other companies involved as well. Wonderful, that sounds like a great project, but you have this goal that you envisage. And my respect to Deutsche Bahn that they are standing side by side with space. A couple of years ago, that would have been impossible to imagine. Yes, that is really true with all these research projects. We've become a lot more active over the past few years, especially in the last 2.5 years. We are really close with these research projects because they are part of the ecosystem and we're not alone in this world. The mobility market is an ecosystem, and the federal ministry invests so much money. So this is something that we also do because we are part of an overall system. We're not just the person with a monopoly standing there. So we depend on different factors. So you basically, Tizian, you work together with Dirk and you know Liza too, so maybe we can talk to you about your PhD. What was so moving for you? Why did you get involved with this topic with DAIN Studios where you helped to co-found the business? What was the reason in the beginning? Well, at the end of the day, the issue of data had interested me a lot in the past years. Data strategy in big companies, Nokia, for example, I was in charge of that there. And this topic was started in 2007, also shifting away from selling products towards wanting to create a dialogue with a customer. And the first realization was that it's only possible to have a dialogue with a customer, and this only becomes relevant if you really listen and react to what is being said. So in the first step, that was the realization that we had basically thousands of data sources. Lots of them were irrelevant because the words privacy, GDPR, but still there was no consent. And I was really interested in the topic on the corporate side, but also with other businesses as well in the automotive industry. And we basically founded the company, 3 founders, 2 from Finland, me from Germany, because we saw that so many companies are still faced with this challenge, and it would definitely make sense to tackle this topic. So for us, you said it really beautifully. We have data scientists who love the most new algorithms, but for us that really isn't that important. It's an important topic, but for us the impact is the kick, and that was the reason, the motivation to found the company, and that's still our reason to, for example, use methods like data thinking to establish them, to find ways how these different disciplines, the technical side, the legal side, the business side, the data side, how we can strike a balance here. That's what I learned after my studies, learning so much about innovation. And what really always works is when you bring people together who have different outlooks. So with data, that's not really new. And you don't have to glorify it. It's just simply a further possibility to promote the topic in an innovative way. And if you look at the challenges we have in terms of mobility, the challenges that companies have to change, then the topic of data analytics, artificial intelligence, that helps. And it helps to have an intelligent and systematic approach. I find that fascinating in the past few years. I think 100 companies worked with me, and from pharma companies to Austrian lotteries and casinos. So data literacy, for example, the person who really knows the most about data is the person who works in the casino in Vienna, who I talked to for such a long time, because he thinks about how he arranges the tables, how he puts the machines, and he only uses Excel. So from that point of view, he doesn't really fulfill any of the points. He didn't study, he doesn't use any tools, but he has so much data every day, and I think that's fantastic, and that's something that's great.
Well, otherwise it sounds like stress. Data for me is like an Excel table with many figures, just a raw diet, raw food. Heavy literature you don't want to touch really, but on the other hand you cannot really grasp what you can do with that. But the spectrum is enormous. It's gigantic. Could I do such training on data scientists to become a data scientist, kind of, just to get a little bit of understanding so that I can use it in my use cases? Or would that be lost energy? Well, to become a data scientist, that would take a little bit longer, but that's no problem. As you just said, that's the interest is the most important thing to accept the topic. That's the access to it. And, well, from the side of the methods, the tools, many more options than before. You can try out NLP on a Google Maps site, on the Microsoft Map site. There's much more access than before to these topics. The challenge is the same. So it's rather the interplay. Some things have become easier, more easily accessible, but you still need to accept these things, which we do many times in many companies. One of the most important things are the trainings for the business people, and one of the most important issues to throw them into the water, not just telling them theoretically how to swim, but first jump into the water and try it on the first meters. And we can do it together if you wish. Yes, I come back to that. Thank you for your offer. Wolfgang, back to you. What about the corporates? Do they flood you, so saying, well, it's intelligent data plus data, that's it? So do you get so many mails of that nature, or would you just say you approach certain companies proactively, because then you stand a better chance to work with someone with a basic understanding and also the willpower to... How is it correlated? Well, we have to decide between research projects where you cooperate with companies and industry projects. On the research side, I must say, in Germany, a few things have developed. Recently, in the Chancellor's discussion, there was talk of 5 billion euro in AI. I don't see it. We are still away from that very far, but basically the state and the various ministries are promoting these things, and they want to develop it. On the industrial side, it looks a little bit different. The uptake, the use of AI in large companies, there it starts gradually. It is speeding up a bit, but even in large companies, first need to put 10, 15,000 euro on the table before something happens. They even find it extremely difficult. Many companies do it in-house and just tinker around. Hence, the knowledge transfer has got stuck. In industry, that's a typical German attitude. Maybe Stephan can tell us something about it. But the probability to get an industry project equipped with 100, 200, 300,000, while this probability is relatively small. In US, it looks totally different because there are other sums at stake. Well, many people are approaching me indeed, asking, can we do a bachelor work, which is nonsense. You cannot say something could come out of a bachelor or master work. So it's still kind of a manual brake which is used, and if we don't resolve this issue, we fall far behind. It's an issue of innovation, and in that regard, we don't know what comes out of it at the end, but without that, you get stuck in your old business models. So that's a challenge we are faced with. Me, as a scientist, can live and do with it. I do my job nevertheless for the state, or for our welfare, or our well-being, whereas the big challenge is a need for change. Is that not the worst goal? Because for Google, it would be such a truffle hog. But then you would have to decide to swim from Saarbrücken to overseas. Well, I feel extremely well in Saarbrücken. And on the other hand, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, SAP, Well, they are partners in our DFKI. We are in contact with those people. And, well, how long are people working with Google? The turnaround is about 1.5 to 2 years, mind you. Chinese companies, it's similar. That's not so attractive, maybe for very young people. But they also boil water. They have much more resources. Amazon Research, where some of my people went, well, they have enormous resources, and they do research work in the companies. But that's a handful of companies doing it. And apart from that, the possibilities we have in that regard at the DFKI, which is a Commonwealth Limited Company at the interface between industry and research, well, nothing is lacking there in technical terms, and at some point money plays an important role, but the probability that I want to keep pace with Elon Musk has shrunk to zero and is not an incentive. Well, in the background it's green, so it's not that bad as it seems. Well, no, I can only recommend Saarbrücken. Well, I want to come and see you again. I've seen you a few years ago, and I just inaugurated my house, so we should also meet once again, live. Well, having said this, maybe now our concluding statements on the topic goodbye data heaps. What would tell the people out there what should be different, what you want to see from politics, other associations, to not to work with a pulled handbrake, but with more openness? What about you? Would you add something on it? Well, I have to agree with what Wolfgang said and underline it. In Germany, we really have to work more freely, not using the manual brake all the while. At Deutsche Bahn, we tackle the topic and invest in it, but only to a limited extent. If we compare to other industries, the large American industries, we need not talk about. So what we invest in this topic, it's a fraction. Therefore, we don't get to the speed in comparison that's there. So I would wish to see that we become more courageous altogether. A cultural thing which keeps moving me is that many people are moving, doing Facebook, WhatsApp, what have you. Data shared in private environment, and then when it comes to business and work, people keep saying, well, I cannot give you sensual data. I have to ask the boss first. Well, having the courage there to also taking it more into business, well, it's not a matter of data protection guideline to be disrespected. No, we also need to make sure that we share data more. Let me build up on that. Just accepting, that's the most important thing. There are so many possibilities to find access. There are free of charge courses now, if someone is interested. Well, in the private sphere and in business, well, that's the first thing. That would generate pressure in the companies to drive such things. On the company side, especially at sea level, it's the most important to understand, if you didn't grow up with these issues, just to trust teams. The chief data scientist becomes the CEO of the chief data scientist. It's about bringing the right people together and then develop the trade-offs. And then the journey starts. And then you just move along it step by step. So becomes CPO of Deutsche Bahn, Chief Problem Officer, you name of that occupation. Liza, what about you? What you tell the people here on goodbye data salad? Well, in the big company where I worked, I made the experience that it's important to give the people free space, the courage to try out things. Of course, we are all trained to be efficient and to make profit, but we should also give the free room to play with data and develop the courage to fail, because not everything will end in a great solution, but you must give people the possibility to work with it and to try out things. That's most important. Well, Google has dished out an interesting program. People spend 10% of their time on such work, and other corporates could also consider this. I think that will be a path into the right direction. Wolfgang, you're the last in line, out there on the bridge in the green surrounding. I follow up what Liza said. Data-driven business models need to be taken seriously. We need to get out of the sandbox play mode and understand that there are chances which can be tapped. And if I meet a CEO or CXO, no matter who it is up there, most difficult to convince is the CFO. But if I could give them one message, is to recall their economic studies where they heard something about innovation, and there's no innovation without a risk. But if you don't accept such a risk, then I would say, even regarding this high-tech topic, we are too late and then lag behind. And we cannot afford this in Germany, quite simply. Well, thank you very much for your time. Of course, the actors are available for further questions. I had a lot of fun to discuss with you about these things, given the limited time. That was our panel discussion. Goodbye, data, hips, and think anew. Well, see you shortly, and I'm happy, looking forward to the continuation of the talks. Well, thank you very much, Martin. You have asked many, many questions. And of course, we'll have this topic again on stage next year because it becomes more relevant. You now move back to the Hyperloop conference, which I have moderated the entire day. So enjoy it in the afternoon. It's also available in the stream, so just switch over to the channel and be around live if Martin can be seen in a meeting talk with exciting people, the first conference of this lecture, by the way.